Darrell Cohn and Barry Wilbrad advance an argument against price gouging that is based on the thought of Thomas Aquinas. They argue for a conception of a just price, and have a broader conception of price gouging than most people do. Most characterize it as something that is caused by an emergency, a disaster type situation, that results in price increases, sharp or sudden price increases, on necessary or essential goods. And those price increases are so sharp and so sudden that they are, well, unreasonable, unconscionable, unfair, unjust is the key idea. Well, Cohen and Wilbrad say, look, it's not essential that it be in response to an emergency. It often is, but someone might charge an unreasonable price at all sorts of times. After all, the key idea here is that the price of this thing is too high to be just. It is unfairly high. And I could do that in a variety of circumstances. Someone might walk into my shop, let's say, and I think, the guy looks like a sucker. And I charge that person a much higher price than I would someone else. All sorts of people might engage in price gouging. Auto salesmen, or maybe hospitals. After all, you're sick, you're lying in bed. They don't tell you the prices until afterwards when they send you the bill. And so you might think price gouging goes on all the time, not in response to a natural disaster or an emergency or something like that, but that it can be any time an unscrupulous business person decides to take advantage of a potential customer. So if we have that broader conception, we can think the real issue here is just directly, what is the just price for this item? What is fair, and what would be a price so high that it's unfair? That too is going to rely on an underlying model of justice. Since we're talking about a price being unjust, we have to think about what justice is. Cohen and Wilbrad do that directly by saying, look, the real issue is simply, what is a just price? How do we determine what price would be just for a particular item or service? So let's think about it from that point of view. What is a just price for something? They say, well, it's the price that would be agreed upon by just people, just customers, just sellers. They would agree upon a certain price. It's not the mere voluntariness of it, the fact of the agreement. We've got to have both parties being just. After all, the unscrupulous salesman who spots a rube may have somebody who buys the product voluntarily, yes. But does that make it fair? No. We'd look at that and say the salesperson was taking advantage of that poor customer. And the same thing for the hospital that's unscrupulous and says, well, you're desperately ill, you really need this operation. And then only after the fact gives you the bill, which turns out to be astronomical. In those cases, we could say, yeah, there was an agreement here. You might have signed the paperwork and agreed to the operation and agreed to pay what the cost is. But, wow, that price was unreasonably high. In those circumstances, we tend to think that the seller of that good or service was being unfair, was being unjust. And that's why they say, look, it's not just agreeing on that price that makes it fair. It's the agreement by people who are themselves just. So they define a just price as the price that would be agreed to by the just person. Well, what would a just person agree to? There's a general problem with virtue ethics. We're going to talk a lot more about virtue ethics next week. But the key idea is this. We should do what a just person would do. We should charge for our good or service what a just person would charge. Well, yes, but what would a just person charge? If that's all we say, you might say, look, that doesn't help me. Okay, I'm facing this decision. I'm not sure what to do. You tell me, do what the virtuous person would do. I say, yeah, what is that? That's what I want to know. And so sometimes that can be helpful, but apart from some account of what the virtuous person would do, you might think it's of limited help. And so here we can say, all right, what would the just person agree to? And they have an answer. They say that person would agree to cover the seller's costs, their legitimate costs. But what are those legitimate costs? Well, they include some obvious things, like the cost of actually producing the item. But of course there's overhead. There's also the cost of storing the item, of delivery, of distribution, so of getting the item to that particular place. There is the cost of overhead. After all, if the person has a shop or a warehouse and so on, that's part of it. There are people's salaries to be paid that are involved in the production and distribution process. That's part of the cost. There are utilities to be paid on the building. That's part of the cost. There is the legitimate, reasonable salary that that person, him or herself, would expect to collect. That's part of the cost. So all of those things are part of this. In addition, they say there are some subjective costs that are legitimate. So, for example, there's risk involved, and in the wake of a disaster, there's considerable risk, considerable uncertainty, and those are legitimate costs too. They can be taken into account. Part of the reason we think about price gouging typically in response to emergencies or disasters is that they are circumstances precisely where this comes under pressure. It can happen in other circumstances. The car salesman who spots a naive customer, or the hospital who realizes that it's got people in a very vulnerable position. But ordinarily, we say these things happen when there's a great deal of risk, when there's a great deal of uncertainty, when it's not so clear that there is competition, and when, for example, supplies will be replenished and so on, where there are needs that are immediate and supplies are uncertain and limited, then customers become especially vulnerable, and this situation can easily arise. We also need to take into account, as part of the legitimate cost, the physical effort it takes to do this. Often in the wake of a disaster, it takes considerable physical effort to bring the ice in, for example, or to offer to clean up the flood damage in someone's house. It's hard work, and there may be considerable physical risk attached to that, but in addition to that, it's just hard labor. People deserve to be compensated for that effort, for the difficulty of doing it. People may be doing it in situations of considerable discomfort, in the midst of the floodwaters, for example, or in the midst of high winds, or in the midst of an ice storm. And so this is something that people deserve compensation for. So the costs can include all of that. But that's it. It can't go any higher. And so people can include all of those costs, including their compensation for their effort, compensation for the risks they're taking, compensation for the discomfort that they're putting themselves through just by making these things available in a difficult circumstance. But that's all. They cannot raise the price beyond that level. The just price may diverge from the market price for a variety of different reasons. For one thing, the market contains lots of people who are unjust. But here we're assuming this transaction is taking place among just persons. We're talking about the price that would be agreed to by people who are just. Adam Smith might respond that we don't need parties who are just. We simply need parties who are pursuing their own self-interest, and the result of the market transactions will be best for everyone. But Cohen and Wilbrat would say that's naive. After all, we're talking about people who are in vulnerable circumstances, in the typical case at any rate of price gouging. We're talking about people who may not easily be able to participate in the market, for whom transaction costs are high. We may be talking about people with very limited information, limited transportation, and so in that way unable to participate fully in the market. There may be very little competition in this circumstance. You may be the only one bringing ice into the community or supplying pure water and so forth. And so these are circumstances where they would say the market itself can't be trusted to produce the best outcome, partly for reasons that are covered in economic theorems, and partly just because in the wake of the disaster, there is yet no equilibrium. It may be that you're the only person who has ice to sell, and that means people who really need ice are going to be in a very vulnerable position. Now, eventually, because you are charging a high price for yours, other suppliers will come in and so on. But yeah, eventually, well, that may be too late for the food in my freezer. And so there is strong reason for people to think that the market price in those circumstances is especially likely to diverge from the just price. We have to confront the question directly. Why is that the just price? Why would just people agree to something that covers legitimate costs, but goes no further? Why should we be concerned with meeting the legitimate needs of others? Why would the just person do that? They have three answers. They involve perfect obligations to other people, imperfect obligations to other people, and also obligations to oneself. So let's talk about those in turn. First of all, perfect obligations to others. In other words, the idea would be people have a right to have their legitimate needs met. And Cohen and Wilbreth think that's true. They think that part of what it is to be a human being is, of course, to have certain basic needs, to need certain goods like food and water and shelter. And they go further and say people have a right to those things. In the strong form, in the positive form, that basic necessities are people's due. It is something that justice requires we provide for them. If prices on necessities are set so high that some people can't afford them, we're violating that right. But there's also the question of imperfect obligations to others. In other words, obligations to be charitable, to help other people in need. It may be that they don't have a right to our help, but nevertheless we ought to help them. The underlying principle is that when we can help other people, at small cost to ourselves, we ought to do it. They may or may not have a right to our help in those circumstances, but we don't need to assume they do. Simply say, look, I can provide help here, and it's not that much of a cost to me, so I should do it. So I, in particular as the seller, should help these people have access to basic goods, goods that they need under these circumstances. If I raise my prices beyond something that covers my cost, then I am depriving them of that I could easily give them. And so I should keep my prices at a level that simply covers my cost. Now, covers my cost and including the cost of what I ought to earn as a result of doing this, taking into account my effort, my time, my expertise in doing this, my physical discomfort in doing it, and so on. I deserve compensation too, that can be part of it. But I don't deserve any more than that. I can't charge them more, or else I am failing in my responsibility to help other people in need when it is not a significant harm to me. Finally, I've got an obligation to myself. For me to take more in these circumstances from those vulnerable people is selfish. I am doing harm to myself. I am injuring my character. Price gougers, they say, are tarnishing their own souls. Now, we can understand this in a religious sense, that we are leaving a moral stain on the soul. We can understand it in a strictly moral sense, simply by saying there is a moral stain being left here. We can understand it in the sense of karma, where people are damaging themselves. They are making it more likely that in the future they're going to take advantage of other people. They're damaging their character. They are doing part of what Aristotle would describe as building up a habit of not helping other people, a habit of taking advantage of other people, inflicting harm on vulnerable people. Those are things that are not good habits. They are going to become part of that person's character. They're going to make it more likely that they're going to act selfishly and destructively in the future. And so they're not just harming someone else, they're harming themselves, they're harming their own character by doing this. Thomas Aquinas thought that gain, purely for the sake of gain, is immoral. We should be helping ourselves and helping others, but to seek gain, to seek money, for example, for its own sake, he thought was wrong. Money is an instrumental good. It's something that's good for other things. The father of a friend of mine, back when I was in junior high school and college, sometimes said, I don't care about money. I just care about the things money can buy. Well, he thought of that as a joke, but it does make that point that money is something that is an instrument for other things. Aquinas is concerned that if I seek gain for the sake of gain, seeking money for its own sake, then I am doing something that is fundamentally confused. I'm mistaking an instrumental good for an intrinsic good, something that's good in itself. And in doing that, I am somehow confusing my entire character, confusing my conception of what's worth seeking. The things that are worth seeking in life are not the tools. The tools are tools. They're ways of getting other things. Think about what's really valuable in itself. And then, fine, value gain, value money as a way of achieving those other things. But don't make gain your focus. And so there's an underlying worry here that the person who engages in price gouging and seeks gain beyond what is legitimate in covering their costs, including their own efforts, that's somebody who is making that kind of mistake. Their life is out of focus in some way because they're wrong about what is really ultimately good. They're thinking of gain, of profit, of money as something that is simply good in itself. But it's not. It's something that should be a means to other things in your life. It's not itself the goal. It's a tool for helping you get to the goal. And he's worried that this person is going to be making a mistake that's going to lead them to harm their lives in countless ways in the future.